Hey, didn't see you there. I'm Evan Price of Green Cheek Beer Company, and I'm here to give you craft beer and brewing's tip of the week. The next thing is acid. What type of acid to use in order to drive the pH down on these beers. Lactic acid or phosphoric acid are both going to work great for what this beer style is. I feel like there's almost like a fruity expression with lactic acid that's absolutely appropriate for these beer styles. It isn't something that I would personally use in something like a Helles. I would lean more towards phosphoric acid, but we use lactic acid in these beers and love the way that they come out. Your lactic acid and your phosphoric acid are obviously driving something, and you need a target for what that is. As you're looking at this, for us in our brewery, we're targeting a 5.4 pH on our mash. We're then trying to get into kettle at a 5.4 pH as well. And so monitoring that as you go, I mean, for us, during runoff, we put a lot of trust into the brewers just to kind of know what to do. We're taking these pH samples at every 20% of the runoff, and then we're essentially guesstimating how much to add based off of what that number is telling us. And honestly, you get pretty good as time goes on, and you can continue to drive that into a spot to where it actually evens out into the direction you want it to. We end up at 5.4 pH in the kettle. The final pH that we're after is typically a range of 5.2 to 5.1 to as low as 5 for some of these beers at knockout. And so those acids are kind of what you're after in order to drive those. Sometimes I see brewers putting sodium into these beers in order to try to make them seem more full or whatever else, because they do that for their hazy IPA. Do that for your hazy IPA all day long. I think there's some benefits to what that is. But for West Coast, I think that sodium level brings down that bitterness quality and doesn't create that snap that we're looking for in this beer style. And so I think leaving it out is going to be the best way to go. So one of the things with all of these beer styles is when you're trying to drive a beer with a very high bitterness quality, searching for that and trying to find what that means to you in your beer and on your palate is an endless journey. I can't tell you how many times that I feel like it's under and it's over and it's under and it's over. And so trying to continue to dial that in is challenging. And so some of the ways that you can continue to find the right quality of bitterness is what we're going to talk about. The Germans talk about this super fine bitterness quality, and I think that that's wonderful. And that's something that I'm looking for in a German Pils. A lot of that comes from driving down your pH during the boil, let's say 5.2, 5.3, but maybe even lower, in order to then bring down your hop utilization. You end up with more hop expression, but less bitterness. And so a lot of these beers end up too soft in bitterness sometimes because of this idea that West Coast should not be too bitter. I would argue the opposite. I think that a lot of times that we are after somewhat of an abrasive bitterness. We're not talking about Campari here or anything like that, which I love in my Negroni, don't get me wrong. We'll talk about Negronis after this, next class. But today, the quality of bitterness that you're after is, in my opinion, at least for West Coast IPA, and West Coast Double IPA, is going to be a little abrasive and is going to be a little bitey. And so the first thing that you can look for and think about whenever you're looking at the bitterness quality is driving up that pH slightly. A pH of 5.4 is what we're typically after for, say, a West Coast IPA in order to drive the appropriate kind of slightly bitey bitterness. We're still using low cohumulone hops on something like this. So Simcoe has been my driving force on these beers for, the last 12 years. And so it is something that I was laughed about by our hop rep when the moment I told him that we're using Simcoe to bitter our beer, he couldn't believe that we were spending so much money to do that. I think that mixture of, for something like West Coast IPA, is a mixture of Simcoe, T90 hops, and Simcoe CO2 extract. You can mess around a little bit with sulfate levels in order to accentuate that further. You can mess around with even something like carbonate, chalk, in order to get that bitterness slightly bitier as well. But think about the way that that bitterness kind of comes across, because it needs to be punchy. If you feel like your bitterness is too low, on the other hand, then mess around with in the other direction. Bring down your pH slightly and continue to work towards, I mean, even something like grain is going to pull harsh bitterness from your beer if you're not running off right, you're sparging too hot, and you're maybe getting too many grain particles into your kettle. And so you can continue to think about all of these little things in order to get it super dialed in. As you're trying to build these beers, at least for us in our brewery, we are trying to create a high level of bitterness that hits immediately the moment you sip. And so that bitterness, at least for me in the way that I could try to describe it, because if you've ever read the book, The Sommelier's Atlas of Taste, there's a line in there that I absolutely love, which is, talking about wine is like dancing about architecture. I'm gonna do my best here to describe what is happening in that glass, but it's overly complicated and it's difficult. You get better as time goes on, of course. But so we really want that beer to have this high level of bitterness that hits immediately. There's this really wonderful texture of tannin that is throughout the palate. And then as that sip goes down, you then have a linger of resin quality that just lingers on your mouth. The retronasal of all of these hops and everything else, which isn't just from the bitterness quality, obviously. There's so many layering aspects of going on there, from whirlpool to dry hop and everything else. But this beer style needs to be better. As we jump into some of these other beer styles, we can get into some of the minutia of how each one of these beers are structured in order to accomplish the goal of each one of these beers. For more on brewing, slightly above average sometimes when I'm in a good mood, West Coast IPA Pilsners and double IPAs, click the link below.